So just a little bit about me. Yep, I'm a software developer, as mentioned, and mostly on web applications. But today we're going to talk about Electron applications and how to build a production-ready or secure Electron application. Of course, I'm going to touch not on everything, but as much as I could. So the agenda for the day is I'm going to start with what Electron is, a bit of a explanation there, and I'm going to touch on one of the three main things about Electron security, some main concerns. That's node access, permissions, and the web view tag. And after that, we're just going to have a look at a demo of these things. And we're also going to look at a few other things, because there's a lot of concerns. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to cover everything. And then if you have time, probably Q&A as well. All right, so what is Electron, right? It's a framework for building cross-platform desktop applications. So it's actually sort of a mixture, or it uses Node.js and Chromium to achieve that. So it's sort of built on top of Node.js for functionality and uses Chromium to render the pages and such. So it's a bit of both. And So it's actually used pretty commonly as well. Like if you use Visual Studio Code, and there's Slack, there's Microsoft Teams. So it's a bit of some examples of Electron applications. So it's actually quite popular today, used by pretty big companies like Microsoft, Google as well. And yeah, so these are just some of the examples. If you've never seen an Electron app before, it's used to build quite big applications. So we'll get started with concern one, which is access to Node.js. So if you are just building local content, then this is not a problem. Right? But if you're loading external content, which you can do in Electron, you could just load an external page and build sort of hybrid applications, or just have a website straight up in Electron. It will have access to Node.js, and we want to disable that in the renderer processors, right? Which I'll come to explain in a bit. So we want to disable Node.js, and we want to use a preload script instead, right? And when writing your preload script, you also don't want to expose node handles and other dangerous objects. So just to explain that a little bit more, I've got a diagram drawn here. So the way Electron works, you've got the main process, and every time you load a browser window or a web view, it will create a renderer process, and these are just isolated processes on your operating system, right? They use a Chromium's multi-process model to achieve that. So it runs in its own process. It's also got its own memory allocation, each renderer process, right? So when you load a browser window, that's what happens. But the problem is that the renderer process has access to Node.js, which can be dangerous, as you would imagine, if an external site is loaded on that browser window, right? You don't want, because Node.js, you're essentially giving access to the user's local machine. So that would be the file system, processors, that sort of thing. So what we want to do is create a preload script, which is essentially just a list of functions or an API surface that you would create for it to communicate back and forth with the machine. Because without a preload API, it's essentially might as well just build a web app, right? If you cut off node access, and if you cut off access to the local machine altogether, you might as well just build a web application. So we want to have a preload API that still gives you access, but on your terms, so it doesn't have direct access to Node.js, right? Preload API will contain the functions that the external application can call to achieve certain functionalities. And the way to achieve that, you could just, it's quite easy. when you set node integration to false on any of the renderer processes that you create, you can configure it this way. It will just cut Node.js off on that particular process. And you could also set a preload file there, this preload.js. And if you're loading it in a web view, same thing. Web view can also load the same kind of configuration as well. So that's how you set a preload.js file. And yeah, the next one is permissions handling. So when it comes to permissions, I'm talking about, so you cut off Node.js, right? Which is great, fantastic. But there's still Chromium's stuff that the Chromium gives access to on your local machine. I'm mostly talking about like HTML5 API, for instance. You've got geolocation, camera, microphone, notifications, this sort of thing, right? So the browsers would normally ask the user. Electron doesn't. And the reason for that is that it's a desktop application installed on your machine, right? So the expectation is that there's sort of an expectation of trust. I guess if you would load FaceTime, for instance, it wouldn't always ask for the camera permissions and such. So, but if you want to be security conscious, you want to handle that as well. You might want to check, for example, is that request coming from the right host URL? Is this okay? Or you want to do different kinds of checks just to make sure that, okay, this permission can be allowed or declined depending on what you want to achieve. So it's custom validations, right? And the way to do that, you can just create an event, so event handler. So what Electron does is that on the session, it will raise this, so it will call this function when a request comes in for permissions, asking for permissions for anything such as geolocation, camera, or whatever. So you could define this function, and it will call that. And as you can see, there's a result of some condition. It's hard-coded as false right now, which will just reject everything. But you want to check the conditions here, and you want to check whether it's got the right host URL and such, and the web contents will have that information. You might also want to use IPC to actually communicate and ask the user if you want. It's totally up to you. And then, yeah, I'll cover the web view tag. So the web view tag is quite interesting because it lives in the DOM, right? It lives in the DOM, and it also has its own process and its own memory allocation in the operating system. So what you can do is, depending on, by using smart design, you could actually have the same browser window, have local content that has access to Node.js, and have a web view tag that can load external content which doesn't have access to Node.js, right? So Slack does this. So the web view tag, again, has its own process, configurable like the browser window. And because it's configurable, right, this is actually one of the things that we want to look, one of the concerns we want to look at is we want to always validate dynamically created web views. So you need to have node access to actually create a web view because it needs to sort of generate a renderer process. And what happens is that, the users or an attacker could potentially create another web view in the DOM because you put your configuration as attributes in the DOM, right? So the attacker could potentially create another web view that actually has more permissions than the one you originally created. So they can elevate the permissions that way. So you want to check for that. You want to validate all of the configuration whenever a new web view gets created. Now, the way to do that is the same. It's heavily event-driven as well. But this is a diagram of how the web view kind of works. So you've got the browser window, and you've got the local content over there, and then there's external content loaded in the web view element, right, which is sort of inside the browser window. So from a user's perspective, it's the same thing. Like they're not going to really see a difference depending on how you design it, right? And yeah, so this is an example of creating a web view, right? So you've got a paragraph tag there and a button there as well. So those two things created in the browser window will have access to Node.js, but the web view will not. But well, this one will, because it has a Node integration configuration enabled, just to show that you can configure it the same way. So there's a preload script being loaded, Node integrations there. Yeah, so this is how you check for stuff, right? When a new web view is created, it will actually call the will attach web view event, right? So you raise that event. So what you want to do is listen on the event, attach a function that actually checks the security configuration, and maybe leave everything else. Make sure that it's okay, right? All right, so those are the main three things. So now we're just going to have a look at a quick demo of all those things that just discussed. No. Just connect the HDMI cable. Quick. Okay. All right. Cool. We got that back. So we've got an application here. It's called the Pineapple Machine, and it's actually, you could select a pineapple. You can add a quantity and just click generate any type of pineapple, and it's just going to generate that for you, right? And then you could click let me generate again, which just goes back to the start. Not the most useful application, and probably not the billion-dollar idea that I hoped it would be. But there's some red buttons there, and stuff we could use to demonstrate. So this is actually an Electron app, as you can see. And it's actually loading an external site. So if I go to the browser and just click that, so that's the URL, right? So it's just loading this site, same site. Now, on the browser, for example, like show me some directory on your local machine, if I click that, nothing's going to happen, right? Because obviously the browser doesn't. The browser is a secure sandbox. But if you go back there, click on that, it's just going to list out my D drive, right? So we don't want that. We want to restrict. So that gives this external application direct access to Node.js. Not really good. And when it comes to permissions as well, right? If I go there, and if I click give me access to your camera, the browser would obviously just ask the user, right? There you go. So it's just going to ask it. You can choose to either allow it or block it, right? So you can block that. There you go. It's all good. But Electron, obviously, by default, it's just going to give access to your camera. My camera is right now, it's running. And hey, what's up, guys? It's running. And there's another button here, but I'll get to that, right? So this isn't good, right? This isn't good. So let's just quickly close this thing. Oh, no. Right, so I've got another application, right? It's the same thing, but I've used a secure version this time. So what I've done with this one is I've disabled node integration, right? And I've also disabled permissions. It just simply returns false. So there's no hard-coded to reject everything. And I've also built a preload script this time that gives access to the local machine on my own terms, right? So the preload API is there. So let's have a look at this one, right? So I click this one. Nothing happens, right? Because there's no access to Node.js. Camera, nothing happens, because that's also turned off. Now, I've got this text file right here. This is safe, it's called safe content, right? So this is safe content, content's okay. This text file is on my local machine, and I want the Electron application to have access to this text file, and only this text file, right? So that's what I've done here. I've used a preload API to do that. And so if I click get content from a safe file, it'll just get that content from that text file and then display it right there. So, and if I make an update, for instance, I'll add, save it, and click that, and it's going to retrieve that, right? So that's how the preload API works. Gives you access to your local machine, so it's quite a bit more powerful than a web app if you use a preload API, right? So that's the secure version, and now we're going to look at the web view tag, right? Let's open the web view version of this. Okay. So it's got the secure version loaded as a web view, right? So if I click on these, nothing's going to happen. Once again, there's no node access, right? All good. So it's got the secure version on the web view, but the top bit over here, there's a button here called get the directory from here, right? That's actually a local file. The HTML file is just locally on my machine. It's not loaded externally. It's not coming from any server. So that's safe. So it has full access to Node.js, right? But the web view tag doesn't, and it's isolated in process, and so it got its own memory allocation as well. So you can see that if you actually design it in a smart way, you could have really powerful features, maybe a sidebar or something like that, and then just load that web application, external application, and create nice hybrid desktop applications, and also have a consistent looking web application on the browser as well. Again, Slack does this, I believe. All right, so head back. Now, let's start off from the column. Oh, not again. All right. Okay, so going to look at a few other things as well, which, so the first one is using context isolation for JS global objects. What that is your preload API and your external application. Okay, good. I'm just not going to move. Yeah. So you got your preload API and your external application, right? Your external application can still meddle around with JavaScript's global objects. For instance, array.prototype.push, right? Or JSON.parse, stuff like that. So what context isolation does when you turn this on is that it isolates your preload API's context, right? So, the external application is not able to meddle around with those objects, and your preload API is unaffected by anything your external application does on the JS side of things. So that's a good thing to do. And allowing pop-ups on a web view. So when you allow a pop-up on a web view, it's going to just create another renderer process, right, with the browser window. And as explained before, that just creates more room for attacks. And we don't want to let web views create more browser windows. Mixed content. This isn't actually Electron specific. This is just basic transport layer security, right? You want to load everything over HTTPS. You want to have everything loaded securely. You could load your external site over HTTPS, and if you've got certain content or scripts loading on HTTP, that's going to be a bit of a problem, right? So we don't want that. And of course, set up a content security policy as well. You just add the headers. All All right, so this is not specific to Electron. You do the same on the browser as well, all right? And yeah, so those are some links. The demo repo is on GitHub. You can check that out for all the demos that I've just done. If you want to see the code base, how that's done. And I've got 2 links there. One is for Slack engineering, because a lot of good content comes out of there. I think the Slack team contributes a lot to Electron's best practices and stuff, so there's a lot of security stuff there. And Electron's security documentation has all this stuff that I just talked about as well, so you could look into that. And yeah, and just a real quick plug as well. We are hiring developers at Provoke Solutions, right? So yeah, if you're interested, we do a lot of cool stuff. Anyways, thanks for listening. And yeah, that's me. Thank you.